Hello everyone, it's Ren here. Happy Wednesday, guys. Happy International Day of Labor for those who are enjoying this day off. Good to see you. Today we are going to talk about the question of types' relationship to truth, and particularly through the prism of the INFJ's relationship to truth. What is truth through an INFJ prism? Can we make coherent sense of this idea? So if you're interested, stick around. Don't forget that I have written a whole book about the INFJ, namely the Ecstatic Soul. More than 2,000 copies sold. Check the reviews if you haven't got it. It's the reference book on the INFJ. I also written a book called The Infinite Castle, which is a novel, and the rumor has it the main character is an INFJ. So if you're into mysterious psychological fiction and you want to explore what looks like INFJ-ness from a fictional perspective, check it out. Links below as well. And there's also a link to my Patreon if you want to support my channel. It's always very appreciated and very helpful. Don't forget that the sequel to the Ecstatic Soul, which will be called The Infinite Soul, is out very soon. In fact, that I am getting close. The work on the cover is progressing, and I can't wait to share that with you. Okay? So, to come back to our topic, the INFJ's relationship to truth. It's obviously going to be difficult to provide like a sort of one-size-fits-all answer to this question, because there's lots of different subtypes of INFJs. You might argue that there are as many subtypes as INFJs as there are INFJs. Of course, if you do this, you kind of defeat the whole purpose of speaking of types. When we speak of types, there's some sense in which we do abstract from individual peculiarities in order to derive some sort of explanatory value from that. The more descriptive you get, the less explanation or the less explanatory benefits you derive, and vice versa, But I think that it's still coherent to try to speak of an INFJ relationship to truth based on, again, sets of empirical observations, data collected by myself from observation of myself and of INFJs around me. It's a matter of generalization. It's a matter of generalities. In other words, what I'm going to say now won't apply to all INFJs, to every single INFJ, but statistically will apply to most INFJs in the same way that some other observations in relationship to truth, by the way, would apply to, say, the majority of INTPs or the majority of INTJs, but not all INTJs, not every single INTP. We always have to be careful to remind ourselves that we're speaking in generalities. In some sense, discourse about types is inextricably linked to discourse about generalities. So if we're willing to talk about types, we're willing to do some generalizing at some point. It's true that in the sequel to this book, in the sequel to the Ecstatic Soul, the Infinite Soul, I propose a new way to articulate the notion of generality so as to be able to do more justice to particularity. And I use Wittgenstein, among other authors, to achieve this, and I can't wait to hear whether you think I succeed. Nevertheless, coming back to truth, it's undeniable, I think, that, again, when it comes to generalizations, there are certain types that are uncomfortable with the idea of objective truth, or at least with the idea of an overextension of the idea of objective truth. That is to say that for these types, and I'm thinking particularly of the INFP and the ISFP, but there are other types as well. You could even include probably the ENFP in here, and possibly the ESFP, maybe to a lesser extent. The idea of subjective truth coming from themselves as a subject, is going to be in a lot of the time predominant, and the play with objective truth is often going to be experienced by these types as a projection from their own subjectivity, which is interesting because in some sense the any in those types is quite pronounced, it's quite well developed, but often any comes as a gathering of information in the external world that is ultimately conceived as something that is projected from one's interiority. And so in the epistemological hierarchy, the last arbiter of truth is very often going to be a subjective arbiter. so often going to be a subjective decision that's made as to what counts as true or not. Then on the other hand, you can have types like the ISTP, like the INTJ, the INTP, the ENTP, maybe to a slightly lesser degree the ENTP, but you can nevertheless put them there, the ISTJ as well, where the arbiter is much more in the realm of the view from nowhere, as Thomas Nagel called it, this idea that you can really have objective truth and that ultimately, epistemologically speaking, the objective trumps the subjective. The subjective is acknowledged as existing, but in the extreme cases, the dream is to be able to account for what we think is subjective truth in a language that actually does justice to, or can be articulated in objective terms. Or simply saying, well, things like our qualitative experiences, like qualia, things like that, are just little ersatzes or artifacts of conscious experience that don't really have any causal efficiency or very strong explanatory value. Really what matters is the way that things hang together objectively in the universe, in the world, and ultimately we as human beings are just a part of the universe like everything else. We are objects in a world of objects, and our being subjects is just an aside in some sense that for a lot of these types, and the idea will be to be able to remove subjectivity altogether. So again, we're speaking of generalities and maybe extremes. Apologies. But if you thicken the patterns to a degree, you will notice that you have these two opposing trends. Those types for whom the subjective arbiter of truth is the predominant arbiter, and those types for whom the objective arbiter of truth is the dominant, is the leading arbiter. I don't know what I swallowed, but it was definitely something that I truly swallowed. And now coming to INFJs. INFJs are really interesting. I've spent a lot of time thinking about what is the dominant, statistically dominant, if you like, INFJ relationship to truth. And I think it is neither the first one that I described nor the second one that I described. I think INFJs have something yet different in relationship to truth. And what I would say, what my observations have led me to believe is that it seems to be of the essence of an INFJ to want to bridge the connection, not the connection, because if it was a connection, it would need to be bridged. Bridge the gap, the seemingly unbridgeable gap between the objective and the subjective. I think that for many INFJs, there's a strong intuition, there's a strong intuitive sense that the subjective and the objective can be somehow shown to be two aspects of the same thing. And one way in which this is phenomenally manifested, because, if we were trying to dig into like what this means, the bridging of the subjective and the objective, we get into very thickly tangled philosophical territory, and it's not something that can't be done, but it would require long probing, maybe in a different video. But I'm interested also in looking at how this is phenomenally manifested in everyday experience. And what you will see is that there's this concept that is used sometimes to describe the Romantic generation of German artists and philosophers around the end of the 18th century, early 19th century, with people like Goethe and Hölderlin and Herder and Schiller and the Schlegels, and ultimately culminating in Schelling and Hegel and Fichte, even though Hegel is uncomfortably related to that generation, partly through his big emphasis on rationality. But nevertheless, this sensibility has a strong INFJ resonance, I think, and you still see it manifested today. And it's often referred to as expressivism. And what expressivism means here is the sense that there is such a thing as objective truth, but if you like, what this sensibility will try to express is that objective truth is not just the truth of, if you, in a rough sense, rationalistic science. It's not just the view from nowhere of, a universe made up of objects that interact according to impersonal causal laws. The objective truth of the scientist, if you like, or even the subjective truth, or the objective truth of the mathematician. This is something that you really notice in Jung. For example, this whole concept of synchronicity really fits that category. It's not subjective, but it's also certainly not objective in the sense of the causally closed universe of the scientists and the physicists. It's something different. The archetypes are the same. The archetypes are a good example, by the way, of something that is empirically posited as bridging the subjective and the objective. In fact, morphic resonance of Rupert Sheldrake, who's a much more recent INFJ thinker, again is an attempt to bridge the subjective and the objective. And I think the relationship with expressivism is this idea that human beings, certainly they have subjective experiences, and there are certain things that are subjectively true or false. But when it comes to the objective realm, which is it's not deflated, berated, or demoted by most INFJs. Like they might be in some cases for INFPs, ISFPs, and so on. The deep interest is to locate what's objectively true in the world that is in something else than purely logical, rational, scientific. Morphic resonance, synchronicity as an acausal principle, the archetypes. Often INFJs will use metaphor, and I talk about metaphor a lot in my videos and in my books, because I think for INFJs, metaphor is a way of getting in touch, trying to express that spiritual, if you want to call it spiritual, we can call it spiritual truth, something that cannot be captured in the completely transparent language of rational propositions, because the nature of that truth does not fit into those categories. But the fact that it does not fit into these categories does not actually relegate it to the subjective. Someone who's fiercely defending the view from nowhere notion of objectivity and doesn't think that there's any room for any other kind of objectivity will be very strongly inclined to say to the INFJ, well, you're actually really just talking about subjective truth, which you're pretending to say are objective. But the INFJ would actually resist this, and would, in fact, if they were to go to, again, a generalized conception of an INFP, for the INFP, what the INFJ is talking about is still objective and impinges on the INFP's sort of subjective relationship to truth. So it's not clear that an INFP would actually relate to this idea of morphic resonance or this idea of the archetypes, or this, which are influential on us way beyond our own private subjectivities or synchronicity, unless the INFP themselves subjectivize those concepts, which they often do. And you notice that in conversation with them, sometimes it's not always easy to not talk past each other, because every party is interpreting, say, the writings of Jung or of Beebe or others according to world pictures and frames that they themselves understand and relate to in the first place. But again, the INFJ frame, or what tends to be dominant for INFJ framing, is this idea that there is such a thing, in fact, I think Jordan Peterson, like in a not completely competent manner, did grasp at it by talking about metaphorical truth. I think that's it's a bad shortcut in some sense, because metaphors aren't true, but there are a way for people who are sort of inclined to relate to that segment of objective truth, metaphors are a way to grapple with something like that. But they're a means. They're not themselves true or false. Okay, so which is why that phrase itself is clumsy. But so the INFJ relationship to truth is actually kind of interesting in between the extremes of, say, the INFP or the FI dominant, and the extreme of the INTP or the ISTP, the TI dominant. The INFJ is kind of poised between the two. They tend to agree that there is such a thing as called matter-of-fact objective truth, and that there's a domain of subjective truth. But they think there's this third domain, which for which the main challenge is not to solve equations or make the right observations or really listen to yourself for subjective, is to manage to bring that domain of spiritual truth to expression. So the main challenge is to actually find an adequate means of expressing it. You see that a lot in INFJ poets. Why do they always sound mystical and metaphorical? You sense the difference with INFP poets, who are often, in fact, much more worldly, and they talk about their experiences, but they're of this world. The INFJ is always it's almost like they're trying to reach into a different world. This other world is not subjective, but it's otherworldly by the same token, which is something you really sense in the writing of these poets, of these writers. And so I would call it spiritual truth because in some sense it's a kind of truth that resists the attempts at rationalizing it and putting it in the straitjacket of means-end thinking or logical thinking. It belongs somewhere else, and for this reason it's not easily appreciated by people of other types. But sure, let me know what you think in relation to this topic, if you think that there is something true indeed about how I've described this INFJ relationship to truth, this third path, and if you yourself may have experienced it. Let me know in the comments, and I will see you on Saturday, guys. Take care. Bye-bye. Oops. Sorry, Chainsaw Man.